I got 3 words for you that I'm going to say out of context. Chili cheese fingers. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, girl, maybe it's time to love yourself. Or at the very least, the sink was right there. Today I'm going to be talking about books that I read recently, but this time with a twist. I will pair up 2 similar books together and say which book did it better. So I'll compare problematic student-teacher relationships like Half His Age versus My Dark Vanessa, romantasies that have knights in them like The Knight and the Moth versus The Isle and the Silver Sea, and whatever other niche categories I can think of. Also, for most of these categories, there's no actual credentials for which book I deem quote-unquote better. I'm just going based on vibes here for the sake of the format, and I just figured that this would be a fun way to talk about all the books that I have read so far in the new year. And what a year it has been. Ever since the beginning of 2026, I have been in a prolonged depressive episode, so I've been trying to distract my brain with reading books. I'm also trying to figure out how to practice more mindfulness. So this year I'm also trying out Headspace, which is the sponsor of today's video. It's really hard for me to make space for mindfulness because my brain is always on survival mode and I don't have the patience to meditate, but I have been using Headspace whenever I go to sleep just to calm down my brain. It's an app that acts as an everyday guide for mental health. They have tons of different content for different situations, but what I've been using most often is their sleep casts, which are basically audio tours that help me imagine being in a more peaceful environment while I'm going to sleep, like a forest or a cafe. My favorite one is called Emerald Mountain. I think I'm leaning more towards like the nature-inspired audio tours.
The far side of Emerald Mountain opens into a region most never see. There are no roads here, only narrow footpaths pressed gently into the earth by the rare traveler.
5 minutes of Headspace a day reduces stress, and 7 days of Headspace improves sleep quality. You can try Headspace entirely for free for 60 days by using my link in the description box or scanning the QR code on screen. Thanks again to Headspace for sponsoring, and now let's get into the books. So the first category is problematic student-teacher stories, because this year Jennette McCurdy released her debut fiction book called Half His Age. This follows a lonely high school girl who ends up wanting to be in a relationship with her English teacher. There were a lot of things lacking about this book that made me decide to reread My Dark Vanessa that I had read a couple years ago, and it follows the same plot about a lonely girl who has a problematic relationship with her English teacher. What is it with the English teachers? Every time they are always at the scene of the crime. My Dark Vanessa was done so well that even while rereading it, I could still feel the emotional roller coaster. I'm glad I reread it though because it helped me contextualize what was missing from Half His Age. So with My Dark Vanessa, it is so poignant in terms of exploring the psychological dynamics between the student and teacher, the layers of manipulation and cognitive dissonance in like the logic that the teacher inflicts upon the student when he is grooming her, to the point that even now when you follow her as an adult, she still retains this distorted narrative that she has about their relationship as a way for her to cope with how much of her life that he has robbed from her. Poignant and haunting and powerful that like I really feel for the main character, Vanessa, whereas I feel like with Half His Age, the characters felt a lot more flat and I wasn't sure exactly what we were trying to explore. I did think a lot of the book seemed to rely more on shock value. I got 3 words for you that I'm going to say out of context. Chili cheese fingers. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, girl, maybe it's time to love yourself. Or at the very least, the sink was right there. Vanessa feels more like an actual person because we see more of her everyday life and her environment. Even though so much of her life revolves and is disrupted by this creepy ass teacher, there are other things going on, like a friend that she fell out of friendship with, or other classes that she's taking, and what are the dynamics there, and how has her relationship with her teacher affected the ways that she's interacting with other aspects of her life. Grooming that the teacher does is also at a much more gradual pace in a way that makes it more believable. Like he does these little gestures that would make a teenage girl think about these gestures constantly as one would when you have a crush. It shows them getting along first and then gradually getting closer and then the lines getting blurry. Whereas I feel like with Half His Age, the main character just jumps straight into it. She's immediately attracted to this guy and she already wants to jump his bones and she just goes for it, I guess. The way that the authors have approached their protagonists are quite different too. So with Vanessa, she feels more like a naive, shy, lonely teenage girl. Whereas Waldo, the main character of Half His Age, feels like she's already cynical and hardened by life and talks more like an older adult that has already been jaded by her life experience experiences. She's actually more similar to the adult version of Vanessa when she's in her 30s, or other main characters that you read about in depressed literary girl fiction where they're very dry and listless and vaguely aware of their self-destructive tendencies. I think there could be something interesting though about Waldo being more aware of the problematic aspects going on, arguably even trying to initiate some of it. That's not a bad choice. It's just a different choice for a protagonist, but I think it would require more self-reflection to conclude something from it. Otherwise, it's kind of like, what's the point? I think Jennette McCurdy has a strong voice for writing. The dry tone that she has is similar to her memoir, which I really enjoyed, and I enjoy hearing her voice in this fiction book too. But maybe when it comes to fiction, I wonder if she should be challenged more to expand her storytelling. The stuff that we get in Half His Age has the same depth that you would get from a short story instead of a full novel. Because all we really know about Waldo is that she's down bad for her teacher, her mom is absent and centers men constantly. That explains how easy it is to groom her, but it makes it for a flat story when nothing else is going on. The teacher in Half His Age also feels flat too, because at least with the teacher in My Dark Vanessa, every line and small gesture or action that he does is so manipulative that you can tell the faulty logic that he has in order to victimize himself and never take accountability for what he's doing. I wish Half His Age gave the teacher there a little bit more agency. Sometimes he kind of acted helpless in the situation that they were in, and not even helpless in a manipulative way like Vanessa's teacher is, where he pretends that Vanessa is the one calling all the shots. Waldo's teacher genuinely seems to act helpless because Waldo is the one being very forward with her feelings and her desires. To clarify, he is still 100% a piece of shit because he's the adult here. He's the one that should say no and draw those boundaries and cut that shit out. The fact that he's willing to engage in that makes it 100% his fault. I just wish that the book had explored that instead of making him simply a lonely loser. And if we are going to depict a teenage girl being the one who more aggressively pursues their relationship, how would she feel about the idea of being groomed despite how she quote unquote started it? Would she even believe that she was groomed? What are the complicated feelings that she would have about that? Overall, I just think a lot more self-reflection is needed on the main character's part and in the narrative in order for it to feel like a cohesive story. Because right now, it kind of just feels like a vibe and we're just going along with the vibes for the entire book. Vanessa's going to be the winner here because when it comes to that book, I got no notes. 10 out of 10, the character journey that we go along with her as she comes to terms with what has happened, the complicated feelings she has about whether she's a victim or not because technically she wanted it. There's thoughtful explorations about agency, consent, complicity. It is just so well done. If you were disappointed by Half His Age or you would have liked more from it, My Dark Vanessa is definitely the book for you. Moving on to category number 2, which I'm going to call Retreats Gone Wrong. One is a psychological thriller called The Writing Retreat, and the other is a satire called Discontent. The Writing Retreat is about a struggling author who receives an opportunity to attend this exclusive month-long writing retreat at the estate of this feminist horror writer. At this retreat is also her former best friend and current rival. They got bigger things to worry about because at the writing retreat, the host reveals that participants must complete an entire novel from scratch during the next month, and the person who writes the best novel will receive a 7-figure publishing deal. It's kind of like NaNoWriMo if it took place in a creepy mansion hosted by a problematic lesbian and other people are playing mind games, and then at some point one of the writers disappears during a snowstorm and then you get into some weird cult shit. And then Discontent is about a young woman who hates her corporate job. The way that she copes with it is just endless watching of YouTube videos. Actually, it's mentioned that she even watches booktube videos. So I'm like, okay girl, I could have given you a shout out if I knew you were a fan. She also uses tranquilizers. I don't know if I could get to that point. I just stick with weed in order to get through my life. But you know, times are difficult. Point is, she's dealing with existential angst, and then she is forced to go on a company retreat where she has to do a bunch of BS team building exercises. And then it shows her spiraling out of control at this retreat in a way where I can't reveal exactly what goes on because it happens in like the last 1/3 of the book. But I did find it kind of funny. If this happened in real life, I would have side-eyed the fuck out of anyone who tried to pull the shit that she did. But it's kind of funny as a reader, especially seeing the fallout of it. Between these two books, I would say The Writing Retreat is more dramatic in a way that just did not vibe with me. I found it a little bit too ridiculous. The antagonist of this book had this grand plan that just did not have any logic. I could not suspend my disbelief that the antagonist would go through so much trouble in order to set this up. Discontent kind of has like the opposite problem, where it is very relatable and grounded with being a corporate drone, but it kind of doesn't offer anything more beyond that. It's like, yeah, I do know that corporate life sucks ass. What else do you have? Otherwise, you're just showing me what I already know. But if I had to pick a winner in this very arbitrary competition that I'm only setting up for the sake of this video, I'm gonna go with Discontent, only because the main character's antics in the last one third of the book I found to be amusing. And then the third category is gonna be romantasy with knights. The two books I'm gonna pit against each other are The Isle in the Silver Sea and The Knight and the Moth. The Isle in the Silver Sea has an interesting concept where there is this story that gets repeated over and over, and it's a story about a knight and a witch, and these characters are fated to fall in love with each other, but then they're also doomed because one of them will kill the other. And this is the same story that will get retold over and over across hundreds of lifetimes. So you're following these two characters that represent the knight and the witch, and as these two women fall for each other, they have to figure out how to break out of their roles and rewrite their own story in order to break the cycle. On the other hand, we have The Knight and the Moth, which follows a diviner who has these visions about the future. She is one of 12 diviners, but then when the other women start disappearing, she has to team up with a knight in order to find them and venture outside the safety of her cathedral. And so you follow these two on a new quest involving gods and dark magic. The Isle in the Silver Sea has a much bigger advantage because the whole concept of stories being retold over and over. I do like reincarnation plotlines, so that was like my main motivation to picking up the book. I also think that the magic system was interesting because of the use of ink and storytelling in order for the characters to create and preserve magic. There's also themes about reclaiming your story, which parallels with other themes about colonialism and nationalism. But I will say that it was harder for me to follow what was going on because they were going through multiple tales and the characters were turning into different characters, but they were the same characters. And it was kind of hard for me to follow that. However, that could be on account of me being a dumb bitch. So take that with a grain of salt. I also didn't understand how the main characters fell for each other. It states in the writing that they are attracted to each other, but I think I would have wanted the romance to have more time to build up, especially when the whole plot hinges upon these two characters falling in love. If they are going to love each other throughout all of these lives and they're going to risk it all for each other, I think you have to have a really strong emotional relationship to cling on to in order to buy into that. But I found it lacking in that connection. On the other hand, with The Knight and the Moth, I couldn't understand how these main characters got along. They were attracted to each other, but they also had good banter and they had good rapport and they were working alongside each other on this quest. They had more personality going on in a way that actually reminded me of Sarah J. Maas books because of how feisty and modern the main girl was. One thing I am torn up between these books is I don't know which is better, not caring for the side characters like The Isle in the Silver Sea, or being annoyed by the side characters like in The Knight and the Moth, because there is a gargoyle there that I assume is supposed to be like a very beloved character among the fandom, but I really just saw him as Olaf from Frozen. He truly was the Olafication of gargoyles. Anytime he misused modern phrases, it just took me out of this fantasy story. But in a way, you could argue that means he had an impact on me. I mean, if we're judging based on the knights in these romances, I would argue that both knights are devoted and loyal to the main characters, so it's hard to choose from there. The fourth category of books is going to be nonfiction about fat phobia. This is a very direct comparison because on one hand, we have Fearing the Black Body, and on the other, we have What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, which actually references Fearing the Black Body. I read these two books back to back because I have been meaning to read more books about the politics of being fat. I remember when I was in college, I would follow these social justice blogs about fat phobia, and when my ex-boyfriend saw that I was following it, he legitimately got mad as he was skimming through and reading it because he didn't believe that such a thing existed. I do think that it was kind of like a new concept at the time, but now with these books, I feel so vindicated. What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat gives a more broader overview of fat phobia. The author shares her experiences along with others and talks about different topics like healthcare for larger people, access in public spaces, anti-fat violence. I do think that it gives a broader range, and it was actually more inclusive than I expected because I kind of had some skepticism since I really enjoyed Fearing the Black Body, which is written by a Black woman, and I often feel that experiences about fat people, at least in the mainstream, have largely centered around white women, and so I did have some skepticism coming into this book, but it was more inclusive. It mentions the racial aspects of things and the ties to Black women and immigrants throughout history, whereas Fearing the Black Black Body goes way more into detail about those things. What we don't talk about when we talk about Fat is more of like an introductory book to people who maybe aren't as familiar with fat politics, whereas Fear in the Black Body is like getting really into the nitty gritty. She paints a historical narrative all the way from the Renaissance days and goes into different works of art and newspapers and magazine articles, as well as scientific literature and medical journals. And based on these historical documents, she shows that fat phobia, at least with how it relates to Black women, actually didn't originate from medical findings, but more so the belief system that came from the Enlightenment era, where people thought that fatness was proof that someone was savage. And savage is a very loaded term, right? Because it often coincides with racial inferiority. And so the thesis for both books is that fat phobia isn't about health at all, and Fear in the Black Body shows exactly how it is more used as a weapon to validate or invalidate certain races or class or gender prejudice. The majority of the book quotes from men writing extensively about women's bodies, including some of them even observing school girls and just writing it down for science or literature or whatever the hell they justify it. And I just know these men were chopped. But time and time again, we see so many people insist on having opinions about other people's bodies. But what I found interesting was how insidious it is that beauty standards were weaponized to ostracize immigrants. It is all connected. I think both books are pretty solid, but I do like Fearing the Black Body more just because it very much focuses on a specific part about the ways that we've developed attitudes towards fat people that could be tied in historical origins. The next two categories are kind of a stretch, but for the sake of pairing two books together out of the books I've read this year, we're going to go along with it. So the fifth category is going to be memory magic, because technically these two books did play around with that, even though they are totally different stories. So we have The Sacred Space Between, which is a romantasy novel that is about an exiled saint and a devout iconographer who has been sent to paint him. However, them meeting each other actually begins to test her faith as she learns the reasons why he became exiled, and they uncover the institution's control of the church using memory magic. So memory magic is used as a way to manipulate patrons' minds and alter realities, and they've been doing this for over a millennium. That's how the propaganda is working so well. All the girlies that have religious trauma are feeling some type of way right now. And then the other book that loosely plays around with the idea of memory magic is An Ancient Witch's Guide to Modern Dating. This is a totally different kind of vibe altogether. It's basically a cute little cozy fantasy romance book that is about a 39-year-old witch who has trouble finding love in the 17th century. Then one day there is an accident with one of her potions and she gets thrown 350 years into the future. And so you follow her navigate dating in the modern world. Memory magic is not a big part of the story at all. It only gets mentioned later on, particularly with the main character's memories of her childhood, because despite how cutesy things are in present day, she does have a sad past, but then later on you find some more clarity regarding the memories that she has of what had happened. And I can't go any further there because that would be spoilers, but I do think the ties with her memories were a nice touch of depth for what is otherwise, you know, like a cozy fantasy story. I think this book was cute and more so like a way to pass the time. The main character reminded me of Amelia Bedelia with her humor and quirkiness, her misunderstanding a lot of terms and concepts that are in the 21st century. The one criticism that I do have is that I wish she had learned not to find validation through men, because that's like her whole goal throughout the story. And I wish that she was challenged more about wanting a man in the first place. And I think it would have been nice for her to simply accept herself without that romantic validation. Whereas with The Sacred Space Between, romance is definitely a strong part of the book, but I don't think it's all of it. Obviously, a lot of the themes based on the premise alone is about religious trauma and how scary but empowering it can be to rebel against institutions that have heavily propagandized a lot of things. I do like that the main guy in this book was very grumpy and surly, and most importantly, anti-religion. Very based of him, actually. I wish that these characters falling for each other wasn't told through montage and we got to see more. And I think certain conflicts that got added, like certain characters being jealous, was unnecessary and more so for the sake of conflict. And other things got added for the sake of conflict, like a letter being withheld that has vital information. But I can understand why you have to set up things a certain way, because this is a very contained story. It's really mostly just these two characters and one setting. But I like the way that the guy had challenged the main girl's beliefs and how she also opened up his very lonely heart. And so for that reason, I think that book has more of an edge. And then the last category, which I really try to fit between these two very different books, I'm gonna call this category, What Happened to My Family Member? So we have Beast of Carnaval, which is a historical fantasy novel about a woman who travels to a magical island that is famous for its carnival in order to find her missing brother. Whereas Fun Home is a graphic novel memoir about the author charting her relationship with her father, who had passed away, and she believes that his death was not a car accident, but actually a suicide. I would say the main characters in both of these books do have a strong hunger for answers, although they have totally different circumstances going on. So in Beasts of Carnaval, the main character is a woman who had been born enslaved on a plantation, but she's now a freed woman, and she wants to travel to this island. The people who perform and play in this island are the same conquerors who profit from her ancestral lands and her people's labor. So the book has a lot of strong themes about colonialism and indigenous culture and exploitation. It just happens to have a backdrop that is more opulent, but it also gets incorporated into very trippy dream sequences as she's trying to navigate the mystery of what's going on. In Fun Home, the main character is the author herself, and the setting is very muted, like literally in the graphic novel. It has a very limited color palette. The setting is their literal family home and business because her family had worked in the funeral business, embalming people after they had passed. Her parents both seemed very cultured and smart and academic, but they were so distant from each other and they didn't openly talk about their feelings or their past very much. So the author's father was an English teacher and director of the town funeral home, and the author did not find out until college that her father was also gay, which gives her more context and connection to her father after he passes, because she also has come out as a lesbian. Knowing now that her father was gay, how does that recontextualize the way that he's lived his life? The fact that he never moved out of their town, what would his life have been like if he had been able to be openly gay? And would he still be alive? Because her theory is that he had purposely stepped in front of the truck that had killed him and that it wasn't an accident. That's still very much up in the air. I went to a book club that talked about this book. Some of us are kind of skeptical about that because the dad seems to be so quiet and rigid and very much a planner. So the fact that he would go out in what seems to be very spontaneous and disruptive way without leaving a note or anything like that, it seems kind of a stretch. But again, the whole book is from her POV. And an interesting thing that she does throughout the memoir is that she makes a lot of literary references due to her father being so academic and very much a reader. In a way, she kind of grounds her understanding of her family dynamics and their stories by making parallels to different literary books that they have read. So even though both these books are different, they're clearly very layered in their own different ways. I guess if you want to be literal with the category of the protagonist finding out what happened to their family member, Beasts of Carnaval does have a more solid answer with the main character deciphering the mystery. And that was the thing that I really appreciated about her character. She was so pragmatic and used deduction skills and logic to solve this mystery. And I really appreciate that she was very headstrong and smart and determined and had like a good head on her shoulders. I do feel like that is kind of rare to see in fantasy stories. And so it's nice to follow her logic along the way. So maybe she wins in that category, because I do think that in Fun Home, the author is really just making guesses and assumptions, which is totally fine because this is her understanding of her family and her father and what might have happened. And I think you could argue that is why her making this a graphic novel rather than a written novel could be a more powerful medium, because she can literally depict her home and her father and what everything looks like through her own eyes. Not all of us might want to read it for accuracy. We just want to understand where the protagonist is coming from and what the protagonist sees, or in this case, what the author sees and understands of the world. And so that concludes the 12 books that I have read so far this year. There were quite a few books that had very direct comparisons, but I do think it was fun trying to think of category to compare two different books. So maybe I will do more of this in the future. If you made this far, let me know which of these books I talked about sound interesting to you, or let me know what books you have read so far this year, and maybe I will add that onto my list of many books that I plan on reading for the rest of 2026. Until then, I will see you next time. Goodbye.
At some point